Devin Dwyer, ABC senior Washington reporter who's been following the Supreme Court on this. Devin, it's not as straightforward as I think a lot of people were perhaps expecting or hoping to hear. So break down what this actually means.
Well, this was a big surprise, Whit, and this is coming from the youngest conservative justice on the Supreme Court, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, 6-3, as you said, in a big win for Donald Trump, saying he can move forward with that executive order that he issued on day one, changing the definition of citizenship in this country. Practically speaking, it means the president can, in the next 30 days, begin to develop guidelines for how he would implement that. It does not mean, however, Whit, that this executive order is free from future legal challenge. Legal cases in 3 different districts will continue on the merits. The Supreme Court, in oral argument in this matter, did signal that it was skeptical that it could stand up to legal muster. But at this point, the court is really weighing in on the ability of...
Okay, so imagine this situation. Trump comes into his second term. Okay, so the federal judiciary is in absolute chaos right now. And what just happened is so massive, so unprecedented, that it's not just reshaping Trump's second term, it's fundamentally threatening the entire structure of how justice works in America. We're talking about federal judges, the people who are supposed to be the ultimate check on presidential power, staging what can only be described as a mass walkout, a coordinated institutional rebellion that has left courtrooms across the country effectively paralyzed, and the White House scrambling to contain what might be the most serious constitutional crisis of Trump's presidency. This isn't some procedural disagreement or a policy dispute that gets worked out in committee rooms. This is federal judges saying they can no longer participate in a system they believe has been so corrupted, so fundamentally compromised by political interference, that their only option is to walk away. And the implications of that decision are absolutely catastrophic, not just for Trump's agenda, not just for the cases currently working through the federal court system, but for the basic principle that there's supposed to be an independent judiciary that can stand up to executive overreach. Because here's the thing, when judges start walking off the bench in protest, when they're willing to abandon their lifetime appointments and the cases they've spent years working on, that tells you something has gone profoundly, dangerously wrong with the separation of powers that's supposed to keep any one branch of government from becoming too powerful. Now, before we get into exactly what triggered this unprecedented collapse, I need to be straight with you about something. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore to give you the full picture on stories like this, because they're either downplaying the severity to avoid seeming partisan, or they're so focused on the spectacle that they miss the deeper institutional implications of what's actually happening. That's why we built this channel, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. Just the kind of analysis that helps you understand not just what happened, but why it matters and what it means for the future of American democracy. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines and get this kind of breakdown delivered straight to your inbox every single day, join our free newsletter. Just click the link in the description and you'll be part of a community that actually cares about the truth, not whatever narrative is most convenient for the political establishment. And if you just want to support what we're doing here, if you believe this kind of independent journalism matters, then joining that community is the best way to do it. All right, let's get back to the video. Here's what happened. Over the past 72 hours, more than 40 federal judges across at least 15 judicial districts have either formally recused themselves from all cases involving the Trump administration, announced they're taking immediate leave, or in some cases, have actually submitted letters of resignation effective immediately. We're talking about judges appointed by both Republican and Democratic presidents, judges who have served for decades without any hint of political activism, judges who are known for being institutionalists, people who believe in the system and have dedicated their entire careers to upholding it. And they're all walking away at the same time in what appears to be a coordinated response to what they're describing in their statements as systematic, egregious, and intolerable interference with judicial independence by the executive branch. The specific trigger, according to multiple sources inside the federal court system and confirmed by leaked communications between judges, was a series of actions taken by the Trump administration over the last 2 weeks that judges viewed as crossing a line that simply cannot be uncrossed. First, there were the public attacks, Trump going on social media and at rallies to call out specific federal judges by name, not just criticizing their rulings, which presidents have done before, but questioning their integrity, suggesting they're part of a conspiracy against him, and in some cases, encouraging his supporters to investigate their backgrounds and personal lives. Then came the letters, official communications from the Department of Justice to multiple federal judges presiding over cases involving Trump policies, letters that legal experts say came dangerously close to threatening judges with personal legal scrutiny if their rulings didn't align with administration preferences. And finally, there was the reported attempt by White House counsel to directly contact the chief judges of several circuit courts to discuss pending cases, a move that violates every norm and ethical standard governing the relationship between the executive and judicial branches. But it gets worse, because according to leaked emails that started circulating among federal judges earlier this week, there's evidence that the administration was compiling dossiers on judges who had ruled against Trump policies, files that included not just their judicial records, but personal financial information, details about family members, and anything that could potentially be used as leverage or released to discredit them publicly. One judge, speaking on condition of anonymity to a legal publication, described it as judicial intimidation on a scale we haven't seen since Nixon, except Nixon at least tried to hide it. Whereas this administration seems to think it can operate openly because they believe the judiciary has been weakened to the point where it can't fight back. And that's when judges started talking to each other, comparing notes, realizing that what they thought might be isolated incidents were actually part of a systematic campaign to bring the federal judiciary to heel. The first wave of recusals came from judges in the Ninth Circuit, the appellate court that has been most active in blocking Trump executive orders. Within hours, judges in other circuits started following suit, and by yesterday afternoon, the situation had escalated to the point where the Administrative Office of the United States Courts, the agency that handles the judiciary's administrative functions, issued an emergency statement acknowledging an unprecedented number of judicial recusals and absences that were creating serious disruptions to court operations across the country. Now, the White House response has been exactly what you'd expect, which is to say completely disconnected from the gravity of what's actually happening. The official statement from the press secretary called the walkout a coordinated political stunt by activist judges who can't accept that Trump won the election and is implementing the agenda the American people voted for. They're claiming that judges who are stepping down or recusing themselves are proving they were always biased, and that the administration is actually doing the country a favor by exposing judicial activism. But that narrative falls apart the second you look at who these judges actually are. We're talking about people like Judge Michael Brennan, a Trump appointee to the Seventh Circuit, who issued a statement saying he can no longer in good conscience participate in a system where judicial independence is under direct assault from the branch of government he's supposed to be checking. We're talking about judges like Sarah Davenport in the Southern District of New York, appointed by George W. Bush, known as one of the most conservative, by the book jurist on the bench, who wrote in her recusal letter that she spent 30 years defending the principle that judges must be free from political interference, and she's not going to abandon that principle now by pretending what's happening is normal or acceptable. These aren't activists, these are institutionalists, and the fact that they're willing to walk away from lifetime appointments tells you everything you need to know about how serious they think this threat is. And here's the problem, because this isn't just about Trump versus judges who don't like him. This goes to the absolute core of how the American system of government is supposed to function. The whole idea of judicial independence, the reason federal judges get lifetime appointments and can't be fired except through impeachment, is specifically to protect them from this exact kind of political pressure. The founders understood that if the president could threaten or intimidate judges, if he could punish them for rulings he didn't like, then you don't really have three co-equal branches of government. You have an executive who's above the law because there's no institution with the power and independence to hold him accountable. That's why judicial independence isn't some abstract principle that only law professors care about. It's the thing that stands between a constitutional republic and autocracy. And when you have federal judges saying that independence has been so compromised that they can't continue to do their jobs, that's not hyperbole. That's not partisan exaggeration. That's a 5-alarm fire for the entire constitutional system. Okay, let's break down what this actually means, because the implications are so far-reaching that it's going to take time for people to fully grasp how much this changes. First, Understand that the immediate practical impact is that the federal court system is now facing a crisis of functionality, with more than 40 judges recused or absent. Cases are being delayed, hearings are being postponed, and in some districts, there literally aren't enough judges available to handle the caseload. Criminal trials are being pushed back, civil cases are stalled, and most significantly, challenges to Trump administration policies, cases involving executive orders on immigration, environmental regulations, federal funding, are now in limbo because the judges who were supposed to hear them have walked away. The administration is undoubtedly going to try to use this chaos to push through policies that would normally be blocked by the courts, arguing that if judges won't do their jobs, then the executive branch has to act unilaterally. That's incredibly dangerous because it creates a situation where the breakdown of judicial independence actually accelerates executive overreach, which then justifies even more aggressive actions against the courts, which drives more judges to recuse themselves, and you end up in this death spiral where the check on presidential power gets weaker and weaker until it's effectively gone. Second, this is a massive constitutional crisis with no clear resolution mechanism. The Constitution doesn't really contemplate what happens when a significant portion of the federal judiciary decides it can't function under current conditions. There's no process for mass judicial walkouts, no emergency protocol for replacing 40 judges at once, especially when the president who would nominate their replacements is the very person they're protesting against. Congress could theoretically step in, they could hold hearings, they could investigate the administration's conduct toward the judiciary, they could pass legislation to protect judicial independence, but with Republicans controlling both chambers and most of them unwilling to cross Trump on anything, the likelihood of meaningful congressional action is basically zero. So you've got judges saying the system is broken, the White House saying the judges are the problem, and no institutional mechanism to resolve the standoff, which means it's just going to fester and escalate until something breaks even more dramatically. Third, the political implications heading into 2026 are enormous, even though this is the kind of story that doesn't always cut through to casual voters the way simpler narratives do. Democrats are going to use this as evidence that Trump is a threat to constitutional norms, that he's systematically dismantling the checks on his power, that the judiciary is in rebellion because judges from both parties recognize how dangerous this moment is. They're going to make the midterms a referendum on whether Americans want to live in a country where the president can intimidate judges and operate without legal accountability. Republicans, on the other hand, are already framing this as proof that the deep state, which in their narrative now includes the judiciary, is trying to sabotage a democratically elected president. They're going to argue that judges who step down are admitting they were never impartial, that this is actually a good thing because it's exposing judicial bias, and that Trump should be able to replace them with judges who will respect the will of the voters. And that framing is going to resonate with the Republican base, which has been primed for years to see the courts as obstacles to conservative governance rather than as neutral arbiters of law. Fourth, the international dimension of this cannot be ignored. America's allies, especially in Europe, are watching a sitting U.S. president engage in what looks an awful lot like the kind of judicial intimidation you see in countries where democracy is backsliding, places like Hungary or Turkey where strongman leaders systematically weaken independent courts to consolidate power. Foreign ministries in London, Paris, and Berlin are reportedly discussing how to handle the fact that the stability and predictability of the American legal system, which has been foundational to everything from trade agreements to security partnerships, is now in serious question. If federal judges don't trust that they can rule against the president without facing retaliation, why should European companies trust that contracts and disputes will be handled fairly in American courts? Why should allied governments believe that treaty obligations will be enforced consistently when the judiciary that's supposed to ensure that enforcement is in open revolt against the executive branch? This undermines American credibility in ways that go far beyond Trump's personal reputation. It raises fundamental questions about whether the United States is still a reliable partner governed by rule of law, or whether it's becoming something else entirely. And here's where this gets even more complicated, because the judiciary's response, the mass walkout, is itself a constitutionally ambiguous move. Federal judges have an obligation to hear cases. They can't just abandon their posts because they don't like how the president is treating them. Some legal scholars are already arguing that judges who resign or recuse themselves en masse are actually failing in their duty to defend judicial independence, that the right response to executive intimidation isn't to step aside, but to keep ruling, to keep checking presidential power, and to dare the administration to escalate even further. There's a debate happening in real time within the legal community about whether this walkout is a principled stand that will ultimately protect the judiciary by making visible just how serious the threat is, or whether it's an abdication that actually empowers the administration by removing the very judges who were most willing to rule against it. And there's no easy answer, because both arguments have merit. If judges stay and keep ruling against Trump, they expose themselves and their families to ongoing intimidation. They risk being targeted with investigations or impeachment efforts by a Republican Congress, and they might end up in a situation where their rulings are just ignored or defied, which would be even more damaging to judicial authority than the current walkout. But if they leave, then Trump gets to replace them with loyalists, and the courts become less independent anyway, just through attrition rather than intimidation. The administration's next moves are going to be absolutely critical. If they try to fast-track nominations to replace the judges who've resigned, if they put forward candidates who are explicitly chosen for their loyalty rather than their qualifications, that's going to confirm every fear about what this is really about. If they continue the public attacks and the behind-the-scenes intimidation, more judges are going to walk, and you could end up in a scenario where entire circuits are barely functional. On the other hand, if the White House pulls back, if they recognize that they've crossed a line and try to de-escalate, there might be a path for judges to return to the bench with some assurances about their independence. But nothing in Trump's pattern of behavior suggests he's going to back down, especially when he can frame this as judges proving they were always against him. More likely, we're going to see an escalation, more attacks, more pressure, and a concerted effort to reshape the judiciary, not through the normal process of filling vacancies as they arise, but by forcing vacancies through intimidation and then filling them with people who've demonstrated personal loyalty. The scenarios going forward are all pretty grim. In the best case, you get some kind of negotiated truce where congressional leaders, maybe even some prominent Republicans who still care about institutional stability, broker a deal where the administration agrees to respect judicial independence and judges agree to return to the bench. But that requires political will that doesn't currently exist and a level of good faith from the White House that they've shown zero inclination toward. In the middle scenario, the walkout stays contained at around 40 to 50 judges, the courts limp along with reduced capacity. Cases get delayed, but the system doesn't completely break down, and this becomes one more example of democratic erosion that Americans just get used to living with. In the worst-case scenario, the walkout spreads. You get to a point where entire districts can't function. The administration starts openly defying court orders, knowing there aren't enough judges to enforce them, and the judiciary as an independent check on executive power effectively ceases to exist. And once that happens, once there's no functional court system capable of standing up to the president, the constraints on executive power become purely political, which means they exist only as long as Congress or public opinion impose them. And we've already seen how fragile both of those constraints are. Legal experts are pointing to historical parallels, and none of them are comforting. Some are talking about FDR's court-packing plan, which at least was an attempt to change the judiciary through the constitutional process rather than through intimidation. Others are going further back to Andrew Jackson's defiance of the Supreme Court. The whole John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it, moment that represented one of the darkest chapters in the history of executive-judicial relations. But this might actually be worse, because Jackson was defying a specific ruling, whereas what we're seeing now is a systematic campaign to weaken the judiciary as an institution, to make federal judges afraid to rule against the president, and to create a culture where judicial independence is treated as disloyalty rather than as a constitutional obligation. That's a fundamentally different and more dangerous threat, because it's not about one case or one policy, it's about permanently altering the balance of power between the branches. Markets are starting to react, and not in a good way. Institutional investors, the big funds that make decisions based on long-term stability and predictability, are reportedly getting nervous about the rule of law situation in the United States. If you can't count on courts to enforce contracts, if judicial rulings are subject to political pressure, if the legal system itself is in chaos, that creates uncertainty that makes America a less attractive place to do business. We've already seen some volatility in response to other Trump policies, the tariff threats, the funding battles, But this is potentially more serious because it goes to the foundation of what makes the U.S. economy stable, which is the assumption that there's a legal system that works independently of political considerations. Bond markets are watching to see if this affects the government's ability to borrow. Rating agencies are discussing whether judicial chaos constitutes a governance risk that should affect America's credit rating. And foreign investors are quietly moving assets to jurisdictions where they feel more confident that legal disputes will be resolved fairly. The one thing that could change the trajectory here is public pressure. If Americans decide that an independent judiciary actually matters to them, and they make it a political issue that can't be ignored. But that's a hard sell, because judicial independence is abstract. It's not something people experience directly the way they experience high prices or bad schools. Most Americans don't think about federal judges until they need one, and by then it might be too late. The challenge for anyone trying to sound the alarm about this is making people understand that when the courts can't check presidential power, when judges are intimidated into silence or driven off the bench, that affects everything else. It affects whether environmental laws get enforced, whether civil rights are protected, whether federal funding goes where Congress intended, whether executive orders have any limits at all. It determines whether you live in a country where the president has to follow the law or one where he gets to decide what the law means and courts are just there to rubber stamp his decisions. So here's the bottom line. What we're witnessing isn't a normal political conflict or a policy disagreement that'll get resolved through compromise. This is a fundamental crisis of constitutional governance, a moment where federal judges are saying they can't do their jobs under current conditions because the executive branch has made it impossible for them to function independently. The fact that this is happening, that judges appointed by presidents from both parties are walking away from lifetime positions, tells you that something has gone profoundly wrong with the separation of powers that's supposed to prevent any one branch from becoming too dominant. The White House is going to keep framing this as activist judges throwing a tantrum because they don't like Trump, but the reality is that institutionalists, people who've spent their entire careers defending the system, have concluded that the threat to judicial independence is so severe that their only option is to step aside and make that threat visible to the country. Whether that strategy works, whether it forces some kind of course correction or just accelerates the collapse of the judiciary as an independent institution, is going to depend on what happens over the next few weeks and months. Watch how many more judges join the walkout. Watch whether any Republicans in Congress break ranks to defend judicial independence. Watch whether the administration doubles down on the intimidation or pulls back. And most importantly, watch whether the American public decides this is something worth caring about or just more political noise they can tune out. Because if this becomes normalized, if people just accept that presidents can threaten judges and judges have no recourse except to quit, then we've crossed a line that's going to be very, very hard to come back from. This story is far from over, and what happens next could define the balance of power in American government for a generation.